Good evening. Welcome. Welcome to the fourth talk in Chicago's Ayn Rand Speaker Series. The Ayn Rand Center for Individual Rights in Washington, D.C. is the public outreach and policy division of the Ayn Rand Institute, and we hold public events like these around the country. The center is named for Ayn Rand, novelist, whose heroic novel, Atlas Shrugged, demonstrates why the individual's rights of life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness provide the only moral basis for a fully free society, and that any such society would have to include laissez-faire capitalism. In addition to public talks, the center engages with public policy organizations and public intellectuals in panels and debates and discussions about current issues and the fundamental philosophy underlying those issues. We write and speak in various forums, including TV, radio, print, and online media. And I'm Lynn Zinzer, and I'm the Vice President of Public Outreach for the Ayn Rand Institute and for the Center. In fact, next month, we're starting a debate series in New York City. The first debate will be March 10th and will be held at the NYU Skirball Center. If you plan to be in New York City on March 10th, I strongly urge you to attend. These debates will be about the fundamental issues that drive today's politics, and the opposing side will be from persons associated with Demos, a left progressive organization. And in current politics, the budget is a current bone of contention. What size should it be? Should we be investing in Obama's agenda? Or should we cut? And if so, how much? Well, at the first debate, Yaron Brook, our speaker tonight, will be debating the executive director of Demos on the issue of what is government's proper role. Is it promoting equality? Is it solving society's problems? Or is the answer protecting individual rights and promoting free markets? The answer to these questions informs the answer on the budget. And so if you can attend, I urge you to attend. If you're not able to attend, we plan to live stream these events as they occur. If you want more information, we have flyers out on the table, and I urge you to take them, or you can go to our website, aynrandcenter.org. I also want to make note that our next Chicago talk will be on Thursday, March 30th. We will be back here at the Hyatt with Tara Smith, professor of philosophy at the University of Texas at Austin. We're delighted to have her speak on the menace of pragmatism. As we enter the next few months of congressional debates, we will hear from the mainstream media and commentators on the need to come together in the middle and to compromise for the sake of the country, for the sake of compromise. In fact, while Americans disagree vehemently about all manner of moral and political issues, beneath that disagreement rests a shared presumption with many of us that the way forward is invariably through moderation and compromise. Dr. Smith will look at this issue through a new lens, and I suggest that this talk will be very provocative as she discusses that pragmatism is aversion to principle and how it destroys values and strangles American business. Before we begin tonight's talk, I want to note the generosity of certain local sponsors and donors who made this series of talks possible. They are Tim Bloom, David Strasberg, Jonathan Honig, Donald and Linda Duell, Russ Rosenzweig, and 2 other anonymous sponsors. Without the generosity of these people and their companies, these talks would not have been possible. They funded and made these talks available for you to come and attend without any charge. So please join me in thanking them. If you would like to join them in sponsoring these talks or other events or projects of the Ayn Rand Institute or the Ayn Rand Center for Individual Rights, please see me after the program. Or visit our websites. The Ayn Rand Center and the Ayn Rand Institute is a 501c3 organization, and donations are fully tax deductible as allowed by law. And I'd also like to thank the volunteers who were at the door and at the table outside. They are all members of the local Objectivist Society, and if you wish to find out more about this local organization, please see one of them afterwards. Now let's get to tonight's talk. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for tonight, Yaron Brook. Dr. Brook is a naturalized citizen who came from Israel with his wife to live in a better, a freer society. He obtained a PhD in finance from the University of Texas at Austin and was a finance professor for 7 years at Santa Clara University. He is currently the executive director of the Ayn Rand Institute. He speaks around the world about Ayn Rand and her ideas. He just returned from England, where he spoke in London and at both Cambridge and Oxford universities. He will be speaking at the end of this month at the Tea Party Patriots American Policy Summit in Phoenix. And then, of course, he leads off the New York City debates next month. He also has a Forbes.com column with Don Watkins called The Objectivist that comes out every 2 weeks, and he is a frequent guest on national TV news and opinion shows. He will speak this evening in defense of finance. The talk will be about 45 minutes, and then we will have a question and answer period that will last until 8 o'clock. And we'll have, instead of, as we've done in the past, lining up in the center aisle, we're going to move the stand over, and you'll line up over here to the side. So without further ado, Dr. Brook.
Thank you, Lynn. And I guess this is our first experiment tonight. We're actually live streaming this talk, so it's on Facebook right now. A little strange. So hopefully there are a lot more people, there are even more people watching this on Facebook. More people, Daniel? What are we up to? About 250 people are watching us now on Facebook, so that's cool. And in this weather, I would stay home and watch it on Facebook. So thank you all for braving the weather, although thank you also for fixing it so I get the nicest days for the last 2 months in Chicago when I'm here. So financiers, finance. You know, financiers have been demonized. They have been portrayed as evil and the devil. They've been killed. They've been criminalized. They've been put in jail. You know, for the last 2,000 years. And this is before Dodd-Frank was even passed. Those of you know that's the latest atrocity in terms of regulations of the financial industry. Here's a class of individuals in a profession that almost universally, literally for the last 2,000 years, has been demonized. Dante puts the moneylender, right, the precursor to the modern banker and financier, near the very bottom of hell, you know, being dragged down by the bag of money around his neck. Those of you familiar with Shakespeare, Shylock is one of the great Shakespearean villains of all time. He is the Jewish moneylender that is hated really more for being a moneylender than he is for being Jewish. Indeed, one could argue that much of anti-Semitism of the Middle Ages is a consequence of the fact that Jews were, to some extent, forced into the profession of moneylending. It was the one way in which they could make money in a world that would not allow them to own any land or any real businesses. Every major playwright and author over the centuries has written books in which financiers have been the villains. I used to teach a class called Finance and Ethics. And at the beginning of the semester, I used to tell the students, I want you to go, and you've got the whole semester to do this, I want you to go and find a movie in which a financier, a successful financier, is portrayed positively. And don't bring me It's a Wonderful Life, right? Everybody seen It's a Wonderful Life? Because in It's a Wonderful Life, the successful financier is the bad guy. He's the villain. You know why? Because he dares to foreclose on loans when people don't pay him back. And he makes lots of money. If you remember, he's the one who's willing to buy out our hero's failed bank. He can't even keep track of his uncle, you know, who's misplaces $8,000, which in the Great Depression was a lot of money. So in It's a Wonderful Life, the hero is the failed banker because he won't foreclose on people who won't pay their loans. So you've got a whole semester to find one movie in which a successful financier is portrayed positively. You know, and it's the toughest assignment they have the whole year because they're very few. You know, you can broaden it to businessmen, and they're very few, but financiers, there's almost none. To use Dante's analogy, financiers are businessmen on some of those rungs of hell, financiers at the lowest of those rungs that involve business. They were condemned again for usury and money lending. Every financial crisis of the last 2,000 years, in one way or another, has been blamed on financiers. You know, in the old days, it was money lenders. Then it was, bankers. And now, for the last 100 years, it's been Wall Street. Why did the Great Depression happen? Because of rampant speculation on the stock market and Wall Street and the greed of Wall Street bankers. Is that true, you might ask an economist today? Oh, no. We now understand that the Federal Reserve really caused the Great Depression, made it deeper than it needed to be, and that government policy, was a disaster right after the stock market crash of '29. What caused the recent financial crisis? Well, of course, it was Wall Street. It was the greed of bankers and mortgage bankers and securitization business and derivatives and I love it when Congress, talk about finance when they have one of these CEOs of the banks and they're whipping them right from the bench, and they ask them these questions about CDOs and CDSs and all this terminology. And I wish just once one of these CEOs would look up at the bench and say, "Congressman, would you care to define to me what a CDO or a CDS is, given that you're questioning them?" I mean, they don't even know, but they're to blame, right? CDSs are to blame. CDOs are to blame. And bankers are to blame. Now, I'm not going to go into a whole spiel about what really caused the financial crisis. I did that in a talk I gave you 6 months ago, and there's plenty of me talking about the financial crisis on the web, so I encourage you to go there. But it wasn't bankers. This crisis, and if it was bankers, it was central bankers, but I just considered them a branch of government, another set of bureaucrats. So what caused this crisis was government from beginning to end. And yeah, there were some people who did bad stuff, but there are always people who commit bad stuff. That always happens. But that's not what causes major dramatic economic events. In this case, clearly, this financial crisis, and in 10 years, all economists will agree on this financial crisis was caused by government, not by Wall Street, not by the financiers. So you have to ask the question, well, what is it about finance? What is it about money lending? What is it about usury? What is it about Wall Street, about derivatives, about all these instruments? What is it that creates such fear, such anxiety, such hatred? And why are they so demonized? And why are they always for the last 2,000 years, every financial crisis, they are the scapegoat? Why are they such a scapegoat, and why do we all buy into it? Almost everybody buys into it. And it doesn't matter if you're Democrat or Republican. McCain blamed the crisis on Wall Street just as Obama did. Sarah Palin has blamed it all on Wall Street and goes after, it's easy on the campaign trail to blame everything on bankers and and Wall Street, and we, qua the public, respond positively to that. Otherwise, you know what, politicians wouldn't do it. They're very attuned to what gets us going. So what is it about finance? What is it about this profession? And, you know, the classical explanation for this is, look, the problem is that finance is fundamentally not a productive activity. This is the economic traditional explanation. It's just paper shuffling. It's just they don't create anything. They don't make anything. And this has a long history, this attitude. So this isn't something modern. If you'd asked, you know, Aristotle, the great philosopher, one of my favorites certainly, but not in this topic. If you'd asked Aristotle about money lending and about interest on money, he would have said that's wrong. Because he would have said, he called it money is barren. Money doesn't create more money. So it's wrong to charge interest because there's no productive function for the banker, for the money lender. He's not adding anything to the process. And, you know, that has been an economic view that goes back again to Aristotle and has been reasserted over and over and over again. And, you know, once in a while economists scratch their head and they look around and they say, if it's not productive, then how come wherever there's a booming economy, they happen to be bankers, and lots of them. You know, going back again to the Renaissance, Italy booms and the bankers in Florence and the Jewish money lenders all over the place. And as capitalism develops, you know, money centers develop and the profession of finance just becomes more sophisticated and more complex. So, you know, this has been a real challenge for economists. And to this day, so many people just don't get the productive nature of finance, of financiers, of financial markets, of financial institutions. It's really hard for them. It's really easy if you make stuff, right? If you're Microsoft, I mean, they get harassed as well, but relatively less. You know, because you can show, here's a product. Here's a product that I made and you guys are using it. You guys are clearly benefiting from something I made. And here it is. I can show it to you. It's visual. Finance doesn't work that way. It's abstract. It's complicated. It's difficult. It requires mental effort to understand the activities of a financier and to understand the benefit that we all get from those activities. It's not easy. It took until the 17th, 18th century until people started to get that banking was a productive activity and the charging interest was okay. And you get economists in the 17th, 18th century starting to get that. Even then, they were a little suspicious of it. Even then, they argue against levels of interest that are too high. That's bad. They call that usury. But it took them a long time. They had to get a lot of evidence from human activity to figure out that this is a productive activity because it's so abstract. Because it really is hard. It's objectively difficult to get. People like concrete. They like, you know, to see. They're very visual. And, you know, unfortunately, they don't spend a lot of time thinking about these things. And this definitely requires ability to think abstractly, because that's what financiers do. They do something that's very abstract. So what is it? What is it that finance does? So what is the case for finance being a productive endeavor? Well, you know, let's take an example, and a controversial example. Why not? Because this guy went to jail for being a successful financier. And let's take Michael Milken, one of my personal heroes, who did land up in jail, and I think landed up in jail primarily for his virtue, for his successes. But put that aside. You know, look at what is it that Michael Milken did, right? Did he do anything productive in the economy? Did he add any value? Did he make anything possible? So let's look at, you know, I like to use my iPhone, but, you know, all these things that we all have. depend on a lot of infrastructure. Huge amount of infrastructure went in. And really the beginnings of creating this infrastructure that makes our cell phones possible today were in the early 1980s. In the early 1980s, AT&T had a monopoly over long-distance phone calls, a government-protected monopoly, and it was broken up, basically. Suddenly there was opportunity for competition. And the first company to compete with AT&T and really start competition on long distance phone call was a company called MCI. It doesn't exist anymore. It was rolled up, I think, into WorldCom. And MCI had the idea of laying advanced fiber optics networks all over the country. But that involved massive amounts of work, right? They had to dig up the US and lay cable. AT&T already had the cable in it. You remember your economics lesson, big barrier to entry? Right? So here's MCI. They've got a vision. They've got an idea. But they need billions of dollars. And they try to raise it. And they try to issue stock. And they try to think about issuing bonds. And it's just too difficult of a project to value and too difficult of a project, too risky of a project to get easy access to capital for. And the guy who steps in and ultimately finds a way to get them capital and therefore makes it possible. Because remember, when you lay down the fiber, when you do all that, what revenue is coming in? None. How are you paying those employees? You might say they're not working for anything. They're gonna not take any salary, and they're gonna wait until the venture's profitable, and then they're gonna take a percentage of the profit, right? Just doesn't happen, right? They want to get paid now, even though there's no revenue. They want to get paid now. And the suppliers and all the people involved in digging this up, how do they get paid? And how do you build it if you don't pay them? You can't. So you have to have capital in advance in order to make it possible to pay all these guys. That's where the financier steps in and puts together the money to make it possible to pay their employees, to buy the fiber, to dig the holes, to get the switches and the technology, and I don't know what else goes into creating a network, but it's complicated and it's expensive. That does not happen without financial markets that can aggregate the money, without people figuring out how to put in this case it was a junk, they called it junk, but it was a high yield bond. Then that's how they did it. They raised a lot of money with a high yield bond, paid a high interest rates to the investors in order to lay this. But somebody had to create that financial infrastructure. Somebody had to go out and raise the money from the capitalists. And one of the things that's crucial when we talk about, Marxists who claim that everything is created through labor. Labor doesn't exist. There's no such thing as an employee without capital. You know what we are without capital? We're subsistence farmers. We're subsistence farmers. Capital creates the infrastructure to give us jobs. Because none of us work for profits that might be one day in the future. Doesn't happen. So, they've got it all reversed. They think manual labor starts and then the capitalist gets rich off of the manual labor. No. The manual labor is getting any kind of return only because the capitalist has capital to invest and chooses to invest in that particular project. So Michael Milken is that financier, is that capitalist. This is why, by the way, we call it capitalism. People always question, should it be called capitalism? Because capitalism is the key. Capital is the key to any kind of economic progress, to any kind of industrialization, to any kind of investment, to any kind of increased standard of living. It's just, if you've ever seen a graph of standard of living over human history, it's flat. It's basically flat. The average person did not live that differently in the 17th century than it did 5,000 years ago. The increases, the wealthy did, but the average, the subsistence farmer was basically dirt poor 5,000 years ago and dirt poor 300 years ago. And then it goes like that. It goes way up. That's the Industrial Revolution. That's capitalism. That's what makes all of this around us possible. So Michael Milken made it possible for MCI to create that network, and he also made it possible for McGraw Cellular, the first cellular company in the United States, to build those towers that I guess future generations are what we all use today for our cellular infrastructure. When Ted Turner wanted to build a cable television, national cable television network, it was Michael Milken who raised the funding and made it possible for us to have cable. Without financiers, without that financial infrastructure, without the genius of one particular financier, but he just stands here representing the whole industry, none of that would have happened. None of that would have been made possible. And then, of course, we shoot up satellites. What's the return on a satellite like that you put out there for direct TV? It takes years to get the investment back. Who's putting up the money in the meantime? Financiers. Financiers are creating the network to make all that possible. And then, what else did Mike Milken do? He used this new financing tool, which is the high yield bond, which is not really new, but everybody pretended like it was new in the 1980s. He used it to help restructure American businesses. American businesses in the 1970s, with these, much of American business, was structured as large conglomerates. If you look at the top companies in the United States, the list of the largest 50 companies in the United States in the 1960s and 70s, and you look at the list today, there's almost no, you won't even recognize the names of the companies that were listed. These were large conglomerates that did everything. If you look at GE today, GE is among the last remnant of the age of the conglomerates. GE makes jet engines, refrigerators, provides financial services, and a bunch of other things. That's how American industry was constructed. And it turns out, experimentation in the market, but you could argue the government had a role in helping incentivize the creation of the conglomerates. It turns out the conglomerates don't work well. They require a real genius in terms of management skills, and there are very, very, very few managers who can run a conglomerate well. Jack Welch, the former CEO of GE, being one of the real exceptions who could do it. So here we are, an America with these large conglomerates, not very efficient, not very effective, losing in the global economic competition to the Japanese and the Germans. And we have these conglomerates going into the 1980s. And what's interesting is if you go into the 1990s, you suddenly see an American industrial landscape that's very different. Focused, specialized companies that do one thing and one thing really well. Productivity through the roof, whereas productivity in the 70s was declining. The landscape of American business in the 90s was very, very different than it was in the 1970s. Well, how did we get from the 1970s conglomerate to the 1990s, very, very well run, very focused, very productive American companies? We got there through the restructuring that happened in the 1980s. Basically, these conglomerates were taken over, they were broken apart, and those pieces were sold off. And how did that happen? To take over these conglomerates, you needed huge amounts of capital. Again, financial markets. Financial markets made it possible for people with high management skills, people who knew what they wanted to do and knew how to do it, but didn't have the financial resources to do it, to use leverage in this case, to take over companies, break them up, and change the landscape of American business. Of course, Congress intervened because these were called hostile takeovers. Nobody liked them, so it's very, very difficult to do one of these takeovers today. But in those days, they were relatively easy, and they happened. And American business was changed forever. And it originated in Wall Street. It originated through financial innovation. And Mike Milken was a big part of that, again, through the use of these high yield or junk bonds. I mean, even calling them junk bonds was a way the media kind of dismissed them and wanted to present them as, demeaning and worthless, and, but they weren't. They were the way in which American business restructured. So finance does a lot of different things. Financial markets, though, are essential for the health of an economy. One of the reasons Japan, which went into recession in '91 and has never come out of it, has not been able to come out of that recession, is because it doesn't have the kind of financiers and the kind of financial markets that we have in the United States, or had in the United States. They couldn't do the restructuring. They didn't have the mechanisms by which that restructuring that our economy went through in the 80s, it was impossible for them to do it. So they got stuck with these conglomerates, and they still have the same conglomerates. Nothing's really changed, and they haven't been able to achieve the efficiency and the productivity increases that are vital for an economy that we achieved and that they cannot, and they're stuck. And I fear that we are stuck there too, because regulations of financial markets have made it very difficult to do what was done in the 80s in the United States again today. Very difficult. So finance is a profession that allows us to reach large amounts of capital. It's a profession that allows us to start businesses. The venture capital industry is all about that. Right? When you start a biotech company, the investors don't expect to see a dime for at least 10 years. 10 years. And during those 10 years, the scientists and everybody else is getting paid. They're getting a salary. Why? Because the venture capitalists put up the money so they could get paid. Now, yes, they expect a very high reward one day. But you know, for 8 out of 10 of the companies they invest in, they either get a very small reward or none at all, and sometimes they're wiped out. 4 out of every 10 venture-funded firms returns exactly $0 to the initial investors. They hope, and the good ones succeed in getting 1 or 2 companies that make them so much money that they don't need to worry about the few that don't. But that takes skill. That takes ability. And you know, if you monitor venture capitalist firms, you'll see that it's not luck. The same firms repeat. The same firms that were successful in the early 80s, are successful in the 90s, are successful right now. Because it takes real skill to be a great banker and choose who to give loans to and who not to give loans to. It takes enormous amount of skill. And it has real macroeconomic importance. Because who do you give? You give loans. Imagine you're a banker and you get 2 guys walking in your office. The guy running the buggy whip factory, right? And the guy just investing in a brand new automobile factory. If all the bankers choose to give the money to the buggy whip guys, you've got a massive misallocation of capital in the economy, and you're not going to get the innovation of growth that's necessary. The financiers, have to identify that buggies are dead and automobiles are the new, and invest in automobiles. That's a crucial productive function in the economy, to choose the winners and the losers. To choose who gets funding and who doesn't, who gets a loan and who doesn't. And the stock market. You know, people talk about, well, the stock market, that can't be productive. That's just paper shuffling, right? My gain is your loss, it's all zero-sum. No. The stock market is hugely crucial. Now, first, the obvious way, it's a way of raising capital. Companies go public and they raise a lot of capital so they can grow and invest and produce. But it's not just that, it's more than that. When people are buying and selling stock, they're doing it based on their expectations of what will happen to this company, what will happen to the industry. They're providing vital information. Those prices are all pieces of information about what the market, what fine people participating, buying and selling, believe are the future prospects of this company, of this industry. And capital is influenced by that. Capital flows to where the future is positive and away from where the future is negative. So when the buggy industry was collapsing on Wall Street, people weren't heavily funding them. You know, in finance we say the cost of capital went way up. And when the cost of capital goes way up, that means it's expensive, it's difficult to get capital. But if the automobile industry stock were going through the roof, what was happening to their cost of capital? It was going down, which made capital more available to them. So the stock market, but by assessing who's good, who's not, who's going to grow, who's not, is vital for the allocation of capital in the economy. It's crucial, and indeed, well-functioning capitalist, semi-capitalist, relatively free economies need stock markets, right? And you look around the world and you can see that. You have to have it. You can't raise the kind of capital modern business needs without them. Well, what about all these derivative markets, and we're in Chicago after all? You know, what are they? You know, they're so, you know, that's much more complex, obviously, than the stock market, much more difficult. But they can't, you know, that can't be really productive. This is just all those people yelling on those floors, you know, around the corner here, you know, screaming and yelling at one another. What productive activity could really be going on there? Well, I mean, there are a lot of things, and you could go on, you know, and have given whole courses on, you know, the productive nature of these activities. But, you know, just think, these are areas in which you can protect yourself from risk. These are places where you hedge risk. And, you know, we'll use the obvious example of the farmer who doesn't know exactly what his crop is going to be and doesn't know, therefore, what the price is going to be next year on his harvest. And he can now lock in a price and reduce the volatility of his profits, and therefore make long-term investments in his own business. You know, today, obviously, the original futures markets were about agricultural products, but today you can do it about a lot of different things. So it's a way in which to protect you from risk. And when people talk about CDSs, you know, what is a CDS? CDSs were, anybody remember what? Credit default swaps, right? Complicated name. These must be really, really hard to understand instruments. I wish somebody would ask a congressman what they mean. Actually, they're really simple. I mean, they might be complicated. How you price them is certainly very complex, and how you actually trade them might be complex. But what do they actually mean? It's simple. It's an insurance policy. That's all it is. I'm buying an insurance policy that protects me if you can't pay your debts, if you default on your bonds. That's all it is. It can get more complicated than that, but fundamentally, that's it. And that's what the CDS market was for. You know, was to protect investors from failure bonds. And yes, you can speculate on them. You can speculate, but the prices, what do the prices of CDSs reflect? What information does that provide the market with? Well, the prices reflect the probability of a bond defaulting, which means of a company or a country not being able to pay its debt. Now, that's important information. That's very useful. And indeed, the CDS market has been shown to be more predictive of that than certainly the rating agencies. But that's not hard, you know. Anybody could be more predictive than the rating agencies. But it's been incredible, you know, they've done a good job. Markets do a good job at assessing risk and evaluating it and protecting people from it. And you can go complex instrument after complex instrument, and there is a productive function to them in all this complex, abstract world of finance. And while it's complicated, it's not that complicated. While it's abstract, it's not that abstract. One of the reasons people don't get it is because nobody tells them. Nobody talks about it. And this is, financiers are to blame for a large extent for this. They don't defend themselves. They don't go out there and say, I do something productive. Here is what it is. Our professors at the universities, you know, the finance guys explain it, but nobody else does, because they're not incentivized to present it. And we have to ask the question of why. Why does nobody explain it? That it's productive. We all benefit from it. Our standard of living is substantially higher because of financial markets, because of financiers. We couldn't exist as a semi-free country without them. No successful economy has ever existed without a thriving, relatively free financial markets and institutions. And none could ever exist. It is the nature of reality. So why are they demonized? Why do we view them all as crooks, as villains, and always have? And this Dodd-Frank bill just makes everything 100 times worse, at least for bankers. It again assumes that you're villains. That's the assumption of most regulations. You're crooks, and now we're going to catch you. We're going to put in the steps to catch you when you commit the crime. So why is it? Why is it that nobody defends them? Why is it the financiers don't defend themselves? And I think it has to do much more than with economics. It has to do with ethics and morality, and generally the kind of mixed economy. And let me just address this point about the mixed economy. I'm sure there are going to be people here who ask me in the Q&A, and there certainly were people who sent me emails when they heard I was going to defend finance. You get all these arguments about, yeah, but these guys are all crony capitalists. And bankers, they have deposit insurance. And they're too big to fail, and we all bail them out, right? Okay, that's all true. But whose fault is that? My view is, wow, under that burden, under all that heavy burden that they are placed under, they still do their jobs. That's pretty amazing. That's pretty amazing. The capital still flows in this economy in spite of all the regulations. That banks can still function in this economy in spite of the fact that they have, on average, 4 to 5 regulatory agencies responsible for regulating every single little activity that they do. It's pretty amazing that in spite of deposit insurance, the banking industry hasn't driven us all into bankruptcy, because deposit insurance is one hell of a corrupting thing. And yes, many of them, particularly on Wall Street, but many of them generally participate with government in increasing those regulations and not decreasing. And let's fire those guys and let's get rid of them. Right after we replace the politicians with freedom-loving advocates for capitalism. But let's put this in proportion, right? The villains are the ideas that we hold in the culture. The villainy is the ideas that over the last 2,000 years have driven us to hate financiers. To a large extent, what they're trying to do is just protect themselves. And to the extent that they are really corrupt, well, let's condemn those individuals, those bad guys. But let's not condemn the whole industry, and let's not condemn the function, because the function is a legitimate function. So why? Let's go back to the why question. Why do we condemn the function? And I think it goes back to ethics, to morality, to what we view as good and right and noble and just. And what we view as good and right, noble, and just is, as a culture, and the way we've been brought up, is to be selfless, is to take care of others first. The symbol of morality and sainthood and goodness is somebody who pursues other people's well-being and doesn't care about their own well-being. We value sacrifice. We think sacrifice is wonderful. I mean, we might not value it in our own lives, but we value it when we see it. We give it lip service. Right? We all, live our lives to make our lives the best that they can be, at least to some extent. But, our morality tells us that what's really good is Mother Teresa. What's really good is somebody who gets nothing in return for what they give. Selflessness. Nobody argues with selflessness as virtue, as good, as the essence of morality. And almost nobody asks why. How did selflessness become the essence of morality? And if everybody's selfless, who's going to create all the stuff that we consume? And why should we consume it? Because, consumption is a pretty selfish activity to begin with. Very simple questions. And if everybody's supposed to sacrifice to other people, then what about the people who get the sacrifices? What are they supposed to do with it? Right? So if we're all supposed to give our money to the poor, what happens when the poor gets all that money? Who do they give it to? Us, because now we're poor? Where does it end? Why is it that the standard of morality, why, has to be the well-being of other people? But think of the consequences of that view. The consequence of that view is we view with suspicion anybody who seems to be acting in their own self-interest. That's not moral. It's not part of what we consider morality. Indeed, self-interest, selfishness, is very much what we consider as immoral, as wrong. That's what ethical teachings, both religious and secular, have taught us for 2,000 plus years. And yet, what do businessmen, and certainly financiers, what do? What's their activity? Did Michael Milken pursue the high-yield bond in order to maximize social utility, in order to make the world a better place? No, not really. That might be an outcome. I'm sure he cared about wanting to make the world a better place, but that's not what drove him to do what he did. What drove him to do what he did was to make a buck. Lots of bucks, as the case may be. To make money. Take care of his family, to build a nice home, to have a nice car, to do good stuff for himself. For the people around him, for the people he loves. And that's what drives businessmen. Most of you have heard my Steve Jobs example. I mean, he didn't build the iPhone to make our lives better. He built the iPhone to make his life better. And yeah, our lives are better too. But he built the iPhone because that was his dream, that was his vision, his, and he wanted to make a lot of money from it. And we buy the iPhone, again, not to stimulate the economy, not to make other people's, not to make Apple better. Right? We buy the iPhone because we want to make our life better. The whole marketplace, everything in the marketplace is about self-interest. And that's a good thing. Adam Smith got this, 200 and something years ago. 1776, whatever, yeah. Right? That's a key year, because you remember that graph I was talking about? That's the year it really starts going up. Because of the establishment of this country, Adam Smith and the Industrial Revolution basically start all at around that period, and it's no accident. So self-interest is what capitalism, what markets are all about. And when I started, I described the fact that somebody who makes a product like Microsoft, they can say, look, yeah, we're in it for our own profit and everything, but look at all the stuff we give for you. Look at the nice little box and the software you use. And here are the things that we're building that you all benefit from. So it's easy to show that it's a win-win and that somehow you're all the beneficiaries, that you all are better off. Financiers are a much tougher time. Much tougher time. Because it's so obvious that they're in it for the money, because the tool that they're using is money. Everything about what they do is money. They don't have a product, an industry, a creation, a visual thing to hide behind. So their self-interest is naked. And who wants to defend self-interest? Well, nobody. Nobody in our culture. And that's why financiers don't defend themselves. Because it would be obvious within a few minutes, that they are self-interested. Nobody would believe them if they claim to be altruists. Nobody would believe them if they claim to be doing it all for us, because it's just not true. They're not doing it for us. We're the beneficiaries, but it's not for us. So the only way ultimately to be able to defend financiers, just like the only way ultimately it's possible to defend businessmen, the only way ultimately it's possible to defend capitalism, and the only way it's possible to defend freedom is to defend self-interest. Is to defend the idea that rational, long-term self-interest is a virtue, is the essence of virtue. That taking care of yourself, there cannot be anything more important in life than taking care of your own life. Of making the most of your own life. Of pursuing your happiness. Properly understood as rational, long-term pursuit. There is nothing more important than that if we care about finance and business and economics and freedom, and much more importantly, if we care about our own lives, which I think most people do. Taking that seriously. And as I've mentioned many times before, being self-interested, being selfish in this sense is hard work. It's not easy. It's complicated because it requires truly figuring out what's in my self-interest, what's good for me. Sometimes it's easy. The cocaine's over there. I could snort it and get a high, but it jeopardizes the rest of my life. That should be easy. For many people, it's not. They still are attracted to the instant gratification of whatever the temptation happens to be. But that's the easy ones. There are lots of much, much harder decisions one needs to make. You know, who one wants to befriend, who you're going to marry, how to raise your kids, you know, what career to pursue, you know, whether to lie or not to lie, you know, when it's convenient. So it seems like, again, the temptation. It's convenient in the short term. What are the real long-term consequences of the decisions I make for my life over the long run? Not easy to do. But it's what we need to do. What's necessary for us to do. It's what those of you successful in business do very well in your business lives. You can be successful over the long term in business without thinking long term, without being rational, without devoting real resources, mental resources, to figuring out what works, what's good for my business. Not cutting corners, not lying, cheating, stealing, because you know that in business it doesn't work. Well, surprise, surprise, it doesn't work in life either. The same principles apply to life. So if we're going to defend finance, we need to defend self-interest. And the only author, other than Aristotle, really, go back to Aristotle, who messed it up on interest, you know, and money lending, but got it right for the most part on ethics. If we're going to defend self-interest, Ayn Rand is really the only author that has done that, the only philosopher that has done that. And I encourage you to read her nonfiction book, The Virtue of Selfishness, to get a deeper understanding of her ethical system. At the end of the day, if we care about capitalism, if we care about our freedom, if we care about something simple like our standard of living, then we have to defend financiers. We have to have a thriving, free, successful, innovative, prosperous financial markets, institutions, and individuals. Our freedom depends on it. And the only way to do that is to passionately defend each one of our right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Thank you all.